Welcome, everyone, to listening deeply to your grantees and your community. This is Andy Carroll. I'm Senior Advisor at Exponent Philanthropy. We're going to spend the next 45 minutes exploring ways to listen with three of your peers in the Exponent community. In a moment, I'm going to invite Kathleen, Jane, and Brian to introduce themselves. But first, why listening? The sessions at Exponent's Fall Conference all have to do with advancing equity and making catalytic or outsized impact as a lean funder. The art and craft of listening well is really foundational to both those themes and all the sessions at our conference. Listening is really an essential skill. And here's why. Listening helps you develop trust with grantees. It allows you to go beyond paper or emailed proposals to learn about grantees' needs and opportunities. Listening allows you to develop an understanding of community needs and priorities, to discover new opportunities to make impact with grants, but also your non-grant powers. You can learn about potential leadership roles for your foundation by engaging in intentional listening. It's a great way to invite your board to learn directly from grantees and the community. Listening allows you to identify knowledgeable and talented people and organizations who could be advisors or potential board members, grantees, and really valuable informants along your journey. And finally, and I know there are other benefits, listening is a great way to inspire you, your board, your colleagues, and nurture new ideas for impact. Next slide, please. We're not going to delve deeply into the really specific tactics and techniques of deep listening at this session. We're going to talk about how listening is a practice within philanthropy. But I did want to take a minute and remind all of us that listening well takes practice. We at Exponent did a peer coaching training a number of years ago, and we used this framework in the training to talk about the levels of listening. Level one is our common everyday kind of listening, where we're listening to the people we're talking with, but also to ourselves. We might be a bit distracted. We're thinking about what we might want to have for lunch or dinner. Um, it's a very common kind of listening. Level two is a much more focused, intensive listening where you're really paying attention to what the other person is saying. And level three is a kind of listening where you're taking in your partner's words, but also really paying attention to their nonverbal cues, their feelings, emotions, and the whole environment around you. Um, for the kind of listening that we'll be talking about with our presenters, we want to aim to be at level two and level three, and that does take practice. It takes all practice for all of us. So I just wanted to highlight this kind of framework, and let's jump in. First, I'd like to invite our speakers to introduce themselves. Could we start with Kathleen, please? Welcome.
Sure. Thanks so much, Andy. Hello, everyone. My name is Kathleen Badaja. I'm a grant making specialist at the Quad Cities Community Foundation. The Quad Cities is a cluster of communities located in the bi-state region of Iowa-Illinois border with the Mississippi River that cuts through us. And so I'm really looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you. Jane.
Hi, Jane McGavro. I'm the Executive Director of the Patrick P. Lee Foundation. We are based in Buffalo and we focus our grant making on mental health and education.
Thanks. Brian.
I am Brian Hunt, CEO of Sherwood Trust. We are a private place-based foundation in Walla Walla, Washington, serving Southeast Washington and the very tip of Northeast Oregon.
We are so pleased and grateful to have the three of you with us. Thank you. This is going to be an informal conversation about listening, and I'd like to start by asking you, can you tell us a little bit about one or two ways that you practice listening at your foundation, either to listening to grantees or community members?
I can start. Because we fund in mental health, really want to understand the work that's happening in the field, but obviously we're not service providers. So I sit on a coalition, the Anti-Stigma Coalition, and it's a group of local organizations that are caring for people with mental illness, and great opportunity to just hear what they have going on, but also, in the beginning, before the meeting starts and afterwards, just those casual conversations that allow you to connect with them and really understand at a deeper level what their day-to-day is like.
Similar to Jane, many members on our team sit on different organizations that serve a variety of different community issues in our area. So for myself, I attend monthly meetings for the Quad Cities Housing Cluster, which is comprised of different organizations tackling affordable housing and those experiencing homelessness, and then a couple other different community organizations as well that our members attend. And that's a really important way for us to be plugged in and know what's happening in our community. And important in those meetings, I'm often going to the community organization itself. So rather than asking a grantee or whether a nonprofit to come to our office, I think part of listening is actually meeting somebody where they're at. And so being able to go to their place is really important as well.
Jane and
We have a very
Kathleen.
formal.
Oh, sorry, Brian. Just a quick follow-up questions. Can you just tell us a little bit, how much time do you spend in those meetings? What is the frequency of them, for example?
Yeah, in our case, they're monthly. And it's usually when we were meeting in person, it probably would take about 2 hours. Via Zoom, we're a little more efficient, but we also lose out on that sort of casual conversation that just organically happens. So looking forward to when we're back in person.
Similarly, ours are on a monthly frequency and about an hour and a half to 2 hours. There's in person or on Zoom.
Thank you. Brian, please.
So we have a pretty formal listening process for grantees and stakeholders as part of our practice of transparency. So we regularly schedule discussions with our nonprofit community and others about grant guidelines, those kinds of things, to make sure that we're incorporating feedback and best practices in that. And we are place-based and we're a generalist. So much of our listening practice is really in the community at large. I hear you, Jane. We really miss live convening. That's a big part of what we do. But I think Zoom is also very productive and there's other ways of doing it. So we try to mix that sort of formal outreach where we're really looking for an objective of the conversation with a lot of general conversation, not just with stakeholders and nonprofits, but in the community at large. If we are trying to make change happen, it involves all of us, particularly in a rural setting.
Kathleen, I was thinking about that point you made about going to where the nonprofit is or meeting them where they're at. And I think in the past year or two, I've really tried to do more of that. And instead of saying, I'll come to you and assuming that's what they want, or you should come to me, allowing the organization to decide, are we meeting for coffee? Do you want me to see something on site? Would you prefer to come here? And that's fine too. But I really tried to leave it open-ended, just because I think their time is valuable as well. And I shouldn't presume to know what's the most convenient or efficient matter to meet with them. So, and I think having those different settings, right, over coffee, the conversation is going to be very different than if I'm on a tour of a hospital. So I think that's a great point, Kathleen. Thanks.
Sure.
Jane, can you say, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, what is it about those times before the meeting starts and afterwards that are useful or powerful?
Yeah, I think, people, when a meeting starts, right, we all get our notepads out and it's a very structured, formal agenda, and there isn't maybe as much time for that sort of casual, like, just how are you doing? And I think that oftentimes someone will be coming in, maybe, and they're looking a little frazzled, and they'll tell me, oh, this just happened at the office, I can't believe it. And then, they shift into work mode. And so having those times where people can just share things that are happening in their lives, and it allows us to be more relatable. I think we all talked about this earlier, that foundations, can be, there's a dominance there that we're trying to correct, and, be partners at the table. And sometimes just hearing that someone's kid was homesick, helps you just connect with them at a different level, so that it's not always this imbalance of power or conversation.
I think those moments are really, really important. We're fortunate our offices are downtown, and Walla Walla is not a big town by any means. But particularly with COVID, it was really interesting how much I relied on running into people in my daily course of business. So those little sort of street side, how are you, things, I think, to your point, Jane, really helps demystify the work that we do, because a lot of people don't understand what we do. And it helps differentiate sort of power dynamics and those other things that we're working on. But that sort of casual being part of the community and being visible and accessible and welcoming, I think, is hugely important for foundations like ours.
What do you, when you are reaching out, say, to individuals and you'd like to talk with them, what do you say to provide some context or rationale? What do you say in your invitation?
I guess for me, so part of my crutch that I was able to use for a little bit was that because I was new to the foundation. So I was able to use, wear my hat of, I'm new, so I'm just trying to learn, but I can't use that card for forever, right? So as I continue on, and I've been now a little bit over a year as I reach out to organizations, really, I tend to ask, I want to know kind of how you're doing, how your organization is doing, and what's important for me to know, and how might I be able to share that with a wider audience, and typically try to mention, I don't necessarily have my funder hat on right now, depending on there's, not a grant opportunity I'm coming to kind of share with you about, but really trying to understand the dynamics of your team, kind of what opportunities or challenges might you be facing right now, and how might I potentially either be a sounding board or just there to listen. Oftentimes I'll say, I won't be coming with solutions or coming necessarily to problem solve, but also kind of ask what would be most helpful for them or for me, kind of what role I could kind of play in that conversation. So I tried to say that in a brief way in my emails to different grantees and also community members as well. I appreciated Brian's point about the community at large, right? So there's the stakeholders of different funders and nonprofits, but also just the community too, and different community members, and trying to learn from them as well.
Right. I tend to favor a relatively informal approach. I'm not necessarily an agenda guy in every instance, but I find those conversations that I get the most out of start with really something as simple as, hey, could we catch up? I haven't seen you in a while, and leave it loose. Or in some general ways, we've been doing a lot of work on racial equity here. And so that's also an opening. Hey, we're doing a lot of work. We're reading these books. I'd just be really curious what your thoughts are. But in a general way. So really, to me, I think it's super important as part of listening, it's really what they say is more important than what we say. And sometimes when we show up with very strict agendas, or I'm trying to solve this particular problem, I feel like it limits the conversation. So that's my MO is, hey, do you have some time for coffee? I'd just like to catch up with you for that. I think you learn a lot that way.
Brian, I have a question for you. Do you find that maybe makes some of them a little anxious, that they don't really know what you want? Or do you think maybe because you know them well enough already, there isn't that element of it? But I'm just thinking through, like, if I received a call, I bet my head would be spinning if I was like, what do they really want? Like, what is this about? How have they responded?
Right. There is a tension between those of us not so agenda minded and those of us agenda minded, but it's a good point. So if it's the first conversation, or if I don't know you, then I really do have something more specific. I'd like to see your operation. I just met this other person who said I should reach out to you because you have expertise about that. But in my situation, I came to this job from publishing a local newspaper. So I have lots of those connections that way. And so I might lean a little bit more on the informal because I have some relationship building. So that's a super good point. I wouldn't start with someone I don't know with, hey, just talk to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you make people feel comfortable? And I think you've touched a little bit on that so far, but there is this tremendous power dynamic. Maybe once you're in the conversation, what do you say to put people at ease?
I usually want to make it clear that I'm there to learn. I think Kathleen might have said, I'm not coming with all the solutions. Like, this isn't, we have all the answers and this is what you need to be doing. It's more about why do you do that way? I think asking a lot of questions and being interested and, in that way and responsive. So not listening that level one where I'm thinking about the next question and really trying to see where the conversation could go. But I think it really is in the spirit of learning from each other. And I would try and communicate that directly, but also in my, forms of questions and just responses.
I typically tend to try to be upfront with my why, and especially there to listen, right? And I would agree with Jane, expressing that curiosity piece and being there to learn, but also just kind of sharing a little bit more about myself. I think, when you're vulnerable, that allows somebody else to be a little bit more vulnerable. And so depending on whether it's the first or second or third time I've talked to somebody, sharing a little bit about my why and kind of why I do the work, and kind of why it's important for me to better understand and have a really strong partnership and relationship with, the folks in our community. And so sharing a little bit of that piece, I feel like people physically kind of put their shoulders down, a little bit and kind of mention that I'm really seeking to look at different ways on how, this partnership could work. There could be traditional ways of doing it, or perhaps there's kind of relationship that you're used to in the past, but I'm really interested in understanding kind of from their end, what does it take to kind of have a really strong, healthy relationship between, a funder and a grantee, or just a community member and the funder as well. So kind of bringing that up to light, kind of in those initial conversations, I think helps break the ice a little bit.
I think, Kathleen, that's super important to be curious and to state that. So I often, I don't know much about how you're doing what you're doing. I'm just really curious to open them up for that. So entering a conversation where it's really about them more than it is about us, particularly as grant makers, I think is important. I'm learning how to put my notebook away, so that takes some pressure off. I'm not here to write down every single thing that you say. It's hard for me to do, incidentally, but for that. But I generally start with some version of, I'm just really curious, like, how did you do that fundraiser so well? Or particularly if you can start with a success, if there's more challenging parts of the conversation, to put people at ease.
Brian, you just made me think of something. So I've recently been trying to, if I see an organization or grantee or partner in the news, like follow up with an email and say, hey, I saw that news clip, even if it's something we didn't fund or doesn't really strictly align with the work we're doing, but just giving them that little shout out, separate from a grant, that we're responsible for. And I think those little things that you do ongoing will help when you do have those conversations, making it clear that you're invested. I recently, it's over a year ago, I did a 5K race. We weren't funding it or sponsoring it, but it was for a mental health organization, and I got a couple friends to run it. And I think it really meant a lot to, that staff to see that as an individual, I was just there paying my, $35 to be part of the race. And the next time, we talk, they'll have that memory that, we were in the community, we're out there to be supportive. And it's not always why'd you do this? Question.
And that's super important thing too. I think that, recognizing the work that people do. I mean, working at a nonprofit in many of our stakeholders is substantially more challenging and difficult than the work that we have. And I do think that there's a lot about validation and just recognizing you're part of the community and you saw this. So yeah, that's a regular part of my practice as well. And you get big benefits from that, just from noticing little things.
Sure.
I'm hearing all of you talk about the power of really just showing up to and being present in the community. Earlier when we talked, you all expressed how important it is to have conversations beyond nonprofits. Can you speak a little bit about that?
I would say one of the biggest benefits in the work of speaking beyond sort of the nonprofit group is groups of people can solve things much better than individuals. And so when we engage elected officials or public agencies or local leaders, it's really helping understand what they're doing and how does that align or interface with what we're trying to do in ways that we might develop that work forward. I think that has to be a very, very wide open circle in our communities. Formal leaders and informal leaders too. I want to make sure that we're not just talking about people who are elected or run companies are not always the leaders. They're not the only leaders.
Yeah, I'd say to add to Brian, I think being able to have that knowledge beyond nonprofits just helps us gain better perspective about what may be going on in the community, or just how different individuals are, how they assess, how things might be going in community, or how they might react if it was this individual versus somebody else. So whether that's an elected official or perhaps an educational institution, or even, our young people. I happen to run our youth philanthropy program here at the Community Foundation. And so I'm always very eager to not leave our young people out as important stakeholders when we're talking about grant making and foundation work. And so I think just that perspective, it helps build perspective when you have that wide variety of kind of different, I don't want to use the word stakeholders, but yeah, different folks, different people that you're learning from and kind of being able to speak to and engage with. And then hopefully, I think in our role at the Community Foundation, we really seek to be a connector of folks. And so when you're able to then have more relationships with people from a wide different arenas, this person says, oh, I have this, and that makes you think of somebody, oh, you really should talk to this person. And so it helps you, I think, also be a better connector when you kind of have a more wide variety of folks in your sphere.
That's a great point, Kathleen. And I think all of us in the foundation work really focus on convening and connecting people. And you can't connect people that you don't know. I was thinking too, just in terms of elected officials, all of us are working on ARPA funding right now in our nonprofit sectors. And if we don't have relationships in the community, that's going to be a hard slog. It might be a hard slog anyway for some of us, but for that, but I just think there's a million reasons to look wide. You can learn something from everybody.
Well, Kathleen, you teed up another topic we wanted to cover is some of the benefits and impacts of listening, the ability to connect people. Are there any specific examples or stories that you wanted to share, any of you today, about the impact of of the listening that you've done?
What a great question. Yeah, I think it's in some ways hard to measure, but in a bigger way, it's hard for me to imagine how we could do anything without listening and relationship building. But I think specifically, it comes to mind if we have a new leader come into a nonprofit, connecting those people out to the community and people who might be helpful. If you have a nonprofit that's challenged in some way, having a network of people and some idea of what strengths they could bring to the table is really important. Nonprofit we think of as it's a sector. This is a community of people trying to make the world better, and connecting those folks and sharing resources is really just a critical part of the role that we play in the community and in the nonprofit world.
I actually thought of one that was given, someone was a good listener and passed them on to me, but there was a local foundation who had met with a smaller nonprofit here in Buffalo, and they focus more on youth, and we do most of our funding with adults. But they suggested that this organization reach out and just tell me about the work they were doing. And so I gladly took the call, and certainly as a reference from a fellow funder, but also just because we're not funding children now doesn't mean there is an overlap of work or evolution in our work in the future. And as I was talking to them, I realized they really should be connecting with one of the local schools who was doing programming around youth and really needed probably some more guidance and what that could look like, the outreach. And so I just was sort of a middleman of the situation, but they were able to connect, and I know that they are doing a lecture series now on the campus, and it required no funding on our part, but it really was just helping, make that introduction for a smaller organization that probably would not have picked up the phone to call a university and say, we think we can help you. So I leveraged maybe my connections a bit, and I knew the school would participate in that call, but I was glad to see that on its own, it grew into something more.
That's a great example, Jane and Kathleen. And I wanted to honor, what Brian said, that it's hard to measure sometimes the value, but what you all seem to be saying too is this is really a part of building your capacity to be effective in your work and in your community. Jane, you mentioned earlier an example of not hearing from a grantee and calling them up and trying to have a conversation and learning something that you didn't realize before. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, I am a little more formal than Brian, maybe. I have a legal background, so I do like agendas and timelines and all of that. But there was a report that was due, and I couldn't understand what was going on, right? There's a deadline for it. They had months of notice. They weren't responding. I emailed, they didn't respond. And it was unlike them, but I really couldn't understand, I just wasn't hearing that anything was going on. And so I ended up reaching out to one of their board members, which typically I would not do, but found out that there was just a host of things happening internally at that organization, including some transition of leadership, departing staff. And so these poor program officers were doing their best to try and get the information, but no one picked up the phone and told me. So I was getting increasingly frustrated. And it was a realization for me that I, one, shouldn't jump to conclusions on why something's not getting done or they're not responding. But I think once they told me, I was like, well, then let's extend that deadline, take another 6 months. And I think it was a lesson for them too, to realize that, it's not a punitive relationship. Like it's meant to be mutually beneficial and good for the community. So, but I I did hesitate calling the board member, but it got to the point where I really didn't know what else to do. And I'm glad that I did, and I'm glad that they shared what was happening. But I can see why they were nervous to tell a funder, oh my gosh, that program, basically stopped. And we need to just work through that. That happens. That's life. This is pre-COVID, so can only imagine the conversations now. But definitely letting them know we're there to help problem solve, not to punish. And sometimes I think that might be the perception that grantees get. So
why do you think sometimes that there's that barrier where you don't know unless you develop that relationship a little bit more or you reach out?
yeah, in this particular case, that was the first time we had funded them. So I think some of it was we didn't have that history to rely on. And maybe being more proactive on my end to just do check-ins with new grantees is something I might do after having this conversation too, going forward. Not just waiting for the scheduled report, but just saying, hey, 3 months in, how's it going? Anything you want to talk about? And opening that space up for them to say, well, actually, like this happened, we weren't sure what to do. Because I do think if I had been able to connect with them, they would have shared it. But so much had transpired in that year of us not really speaking that I wasn't even sure who to talk to. So
I think that's really important also to think that, sometimes there are challenges and there's hard information you have to hear. When I got this job, my friend said my jokes are way funnier now than they used to be because we're funders. But I think that it's really important on that too. And part of listening and being curious and being compassionate is being able to have conversations with folks who you may or may not be funding where things are not going well. And to not show up in a way that you're judging immediately or that you're right to the solution part of it, that it's important just to hear them out. These are struggles that they have in our job, at least I feel like, is very much supporting the struggle. So I think it's really, really important also as we seek out that we are conscious that people sometimes want to give us the good news and not sort of the dirty laundry. And the dirty laundry helps all of us do our job better. So I think that's super important, Jane, that idea of how do you have these conversations when things aren't going well? Because sometimes they don't.
Yeah. Sometimes because I came from the other side, as they call it, I used to be in fundraising and I worked at Hospice Buffalo here. And I often will share that with grantees just because I'm like, look, I used to write these grants. I get it. You want something to be perfect and it doesn't always go that way. But like the more we communicate, the more we can figure out, to Brian's point, like we're all trying to support each other. But I do think sometimes I get a little credit for having been on the other side. So they know I'm not, I know exactly where they are and I've been in those shoes.
Right. The power of lived experience matters everywhere.
And I think what you just mentioned around supporting the struggle just made me think about important conversations I've had or kind of have been privy to with grantees who haven't been funded by our grant committees, and kind of sitting there, right, with grantees when that can be a really difficult, news to hear when we haven't been funded, but kind of just listening to them in those moments and hearing about kind of what might not be going great in their organization, or just kind of being able to understand more of the story that maybe wasn't, communicated through the application, and kind of what is important for me to know. And I've been able to take those conversations, and then when I'm sitting in a conversation with a donor who's looking for new opportunities to grant to, I work with our donor advised funds. It's been really helpful that, I just talked to so-and-so who's a new kind of grassroots organization, and now I'm able to lift them up in this conversation with the donor who's now seeking kind of those new opportunities. And so I just think paying attention, in those conversations sometimes can be just really difficult and potentially a little bit emotion heavy when receiving kind of unfortunate news, but how I can then be in a position to hopefully sometimes turn that around when I'm able to then, lift up that organization and offer them as a potential granting opportunity for a donor who's seeking to fund a new opportunity. So those have been really impactful.
I didn't think of it at the time as being sort of a big difference, but I call people if they don't, we go through an LOI process and an application process for our grant cycles. And I call them and say, this is not going to go forward, or this is going to go forward. And I think, Kathleen, to your point, it's really important to deliver that news in person and to be open to their disappointment, to any feedback that I could provide regards the LOI or that. But I'm surprised, frankly, how powerful just that simple thing of, I'm not just going to send you an email and say no or yes, I'm going to call you and you have the opportunity to talk to me about it. In that way is a very, very simple step, but I think that the dividends are really, really tremendous in terms of understanding the people that we were working with and their goals and aspirations.
So I'm going to admit, I did not call everyone.
You should call them. Yep.
I don't know that I always would have the time to, but I do always offer to schedule if they want to talk through the proposal or what we were looking for that they didn't have. And more people are taking me up on that. I think, we are funding in a very specific area of mental health. So like, it just helps for all of us to have that conversation and debrief and say like, well, we were really looking for this and maybe the next round. But I will confess, I'm not calling everyone personally. So
they're very kind, actually. I would just say on the phone for that, but and it's just a little thing when we talk about like, how do we incorporate this into our work in a very intentional way. That wasn't on my list of things to start doing, but it turns out to be a pretty effective way to be personable.
Sure.
Every foundation has a different approach and culture. I also, Brian, what you just said, that you didn't start out doing that, but you learned that could be really helpful along the way. And just a reminder that listening is a journey, and you're going to probably figure out new ways to listen as the months and years pass. It's a tremendous investment of time with a lot of payoffs. What you all are sharing with us. I'd like to spend the last few minutes talking about how you make time. The common denominator among Exponent Philanthropy members is they have few staff. According to our survey report, the median is about between 1 and 2 staff trying to do everything at their foundations. Let's suppose for a second that the picture a foundation that is where the staff and board are trying to do everything, they're managing everything, and there isn't right now time that's made open for listening, the kind of listening that you've been sharing with us. What are some very first steps that staff and board might take to open up some time?
I think schedule it. I'm not an agenda person, but I'm very much a calendar person. So, and a list person. And I think it's important just to make sure it's scheduled. In our situation, I don't have to fundraise. We're a privately endowed foundation. And so I think in my previous life, how much time I spent on sales and marketing and effort. And I try to think that in terms of outreach in this position. For that. So I try to schedule something every day, at least a phone call or a discussion. And I try to make sure that I balance all the learning that we're doing about philanthropy. I'm relatively new to philanthropy, so I'm super curious and spend a lot of time on webinars and learning that way. And for me, if I'm going to spend 5 hours in a week learning about trust-based philanthropy, I'm going to need to spend 5 hours a week in the community, actually talking to people in the community that we work. So that's my little trick of just making sure that my learning is always balanced. I don't always win that argument with myself, but I think it's super important to it's learning, and you have to schedule it.
Yeah, I also think there probably is more time to spend listening than we realize. So, I gave the example of when I attend that meeting, those 5 to 10 minutes before and after, those are listening opportunities. It doesn't, always, so this is where I may be less formal, Brian, we're switching roles here. I think that, when you're out and you run into someone, like those are the chances. They might not seem like structured listening, but there's always an opportunity to learn from someone or hear something, those unsaid things too. Kathleen mentioned like the shoulder relaxing, or just always being observant, and sometimes even on a Zoom you can pick up a lot just by what's happening behind people, and what's going on. And so I think it is important to schedule, and I think to be respectful of the time of the people you're wanting to talk to, you should schedule when you can. But I would also say every moment there's a chance to listen, to what's going on around you, and that we maybe don't appreciate how much we take in during those times.
Yeah, and I'd add that as a staff and board, perhaps first having a conversation, or I guess I encourage to look at what do you make time for now. So, currently there's a lot that does take up your time, right? And then kind of there are things that are priorities. And of course, there's things we have to do, right? In terms of, like, I think of community foundation and the IRS and legalities and things that we have to do, right, to stay running. But looking at year at a glance, right, and kind of looking at the workflow of the calendar for your foundation and what happens when and why, and why certain things take place, and kind of revisiting, should we still be doing these things, and kind of having just an internal conversation, and perhaps that could act as a reset, because perhaps there's things that you all are doing that maybe aren't quite having the impact that maybe you thought they originally did, or just isn't quite working anymore. So I think that might be able to identify opportunities that way too. Perhaps reshuffling kind of what is currently happening, and perhaps being able to identify.
I like that, Kathleen, though, recognizing when you have more, when is maybe a downtime for you where you could schedule some of these meetings, and looking at the whole year. And so it doesn't always have to happen in first quarter, right? But like, just what's the long-term plan, instead of being so reactive, which can happen when we're lean funders, as we're called.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Deal with the pressures of the moment.
Yeah. I think it's important too, and sometimes helpful for those, there's sort of not rocket science, but 100 cups of coffee I'm going to try to have around the topic of racial equity. Who would those 100 people be? Like, if to organize the work, depending on how you approach your work. To me, the conversations I have with people in the community and with stakeholders and our board of directors, that's the best part of my job. For that. So when I'm spending time with the IRS or on compliance issues, I always want to end the day with a conversation with someone, because it reminds me about the important work that we're trying to do and the awesome people we get to do it with. But those little tricks like that, like sales tricks, I think there's a lot from that world of sales management that makes sense in terms of we think about listening and outreach. It doesn't happen if you don't plan it.
And in the spirit of planning, I just touching on Kathleen's notion of maybe having a foundation-wide conversation. Sounds almost like a conversation that a staff and board could have together. Does that resonate with any of you? Maybe during a board retreat or a board meeting, how are we spending our time?
We had, and this is maybe a different kind of example of listening. So we started this year with having just a social. We invited our grantees and our board to get together. We happen to have awesome wine where we live for a glass of wine. And it was just really tremendous. The board loved it. They got to be in front of people in a different way. The grantees loved it, but there was no agenda. There was no program. It was really just hello, and who don't you know in this room that I can introduce you to? And getting our boards involved in this, I would say also, I think is really, really important. All of us are trying to factor all the things that we're learning doing this at least 40 hours a week with a board who makes decisions often, who doesn't spend that much time doing it. So getting them involved in the community and listening, I think has been I'm really excited about the work that we're doing here, building more of those relationships.
I want to thank you all. We're now just running out of time, but I hope this conversation continues. We're so grateful to each of you for joining us. Kathleen, Jane, Brian, thank you. Thank you, Madeline, for producing. And I think we had one more slide to go before we finish.
Well, thank you, Andy. It was great.
Yes.
Thank you.
The just and this will be in our resource materials as well, but some questions that funders can ask, and these come from you and our other members. So thank you all again, and we hope the rest of the conference is a great opportunity for you. Keep in touch. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thanks.